Now, can I just confirm that you're seeing my screen?
Yes.
So the screen sharing is working fine? Wonderful, wonderful. So just a little bit about me before we get started. I'm the Principal Policy Advisor with the National Employment Services Association. I've been working with NESA, as we're known, for the last 14 years. Prior to that, I worked in employment services, both frontline delivery of employment services, you know, directly interacting with both job seekers and employers, and managing an employment service organisation. Prior to that, I came out of the community services and health sector, where I primarily worked with disadvantaged young people, often people experiencing homelessness, substance use and addiction, survivors of sexual assault, so highly disadvantaged people. And one of the things through that part of my career that I learned is the transformational impact of getting someone to engage in employment. For many of my clients who couldn't find an opportunity for employment, they often relapsed, went back, and sometimes had fatal episodes of self-harm. So for me, employment as a transformational vehicle and something that really can consolidate someone's inclusion in the community and their well-being is really important. So that's why I moved into the employment services sector. And for me, using labour market information has been an essential and underpinning part of making sure that I deliver evidence-informed practice to the people I'm working with, whether that's job seekers, employers, working with community stakeholders across the board to make sure services are the best that they can be. And I think when we're providing guidance to individuals, whether it be education pathways, employment placement, there's a responsibility on us to actually understand what's happening in the labour market. So we give solid and good guidance to those people and help inform sound decision making. So a little bit about NESA, the organisation that I work for. We are the national peak body for Australian employment services. We're a not-for-profit organisation. We were established in 1997 as we prepared for the government to outsource all of Australia's employment services, which commenced in 1998. We have a diverse and extensive membership of providers. They incorporate not-for-profit, for-profit and public organisations delivering employment services and labour market assistance programs. Our membership collective footprint is very extensive and covers 100% of Australia's landscape, so the regions across Australia. So we use our membership as an important tool for actually understanding what's happening within our own sector and making sure that we're using that labour market information to support our sector well. And that particularly comes into play for building capacity of the sector. So we understand our sector's recruitment needs, the skills that our providers are looking for, how they attract and obtain staff, and what the learning and development requirements for staff are. And we deliver a very strong professional development program. We also do lots of policy and research. We partner with many universities to understand the practices in employment services that are leading to the best outcomes for job seekers and employers. So we're trying to unpack and drill down into that as much as possible and use that to inform evidence-based representation and advocacy to government to make sure their policies in terms of education and training, employment services, the welfare system are best aligned to the needs of job seekers and what's proven to work well. So that's a little bit about us. What I really want to, so I'll get on now, just a little bit about the employment services sector so you can have an understanding of the way we arrange our labour market assistance programs. So as I've said, the market is fully outsourced. All employment service programs are delivered by contracted providers. The programs are generally contracted at a national level, but they have local contracts and a local focus. And as I talk today, you'll see that using place-based initiative and place-based labour market information is essential to delivering good strategy that helps to maximise skill development with labour market demand in the local area. We have competitive commissioning processes, so obviously there's tender processes. Providers have to, it's not price-based, it's more capability-based processes. And one of the key areas in our tender processes is organisations being able to articulate how they use labour market information at all levels of the organisation. So how the organisation uses it to inform their overarching strategies, as well as how it's used at the local level in the front line between employment consultants advising job seekers and employers, and developing strategies, again, looking at better alignment of skill and demand. It's an outcome-based program, so we get paid on what we deliver. So if providers fail to deliver sustainable employment outcomes for their job seekers, they won't be financially sustainable. So you must perform in this system or you'll perish. And we have a very strong performance framework where providers are measured against each other. So it's relative performance. So it's essential that you're continually benchmarking your organisation and knowing that you're delivering at least as many outcomes as your competitors, and you're doing that on a macro level, as well as for particular target groups with disadvantaged clients, such as clients who are experiencing multiple issues such as homelessness, mental health issues, substance abuse. The waiting to get them into employment is greater than it is for someone who's more recently unemployed and has greater work capacity. So again, using labour market information to see how you're tracking against your competitors is an essential part of the system. And we also have quality accreditation, and part of that framework is regular checks that in fact providers are using labour market information in their interaction and their strategies at the front line with job seekers, employers, and developing partnerships with key stakeholders, one of which is the education sector. So our role is not only to place people in work, but it's to make sure people are prepared for work, and that we're optimising opportunities where there's the greatest demand in the labour market. So directing people to those areas of training which are most likely to lead to a job. So as I said, training is one of our key stakeholders. So we have around 250 providers across Australia. As I said earlier, they're a mix of the private, not-for-profit and public organisations. They employ around 36,000 frontline employees working directly with job seekers and employers. They're servicing about 1 million job seekers at any point in time, and there's 5,700 offices across Australia. So it's a very localised approach, lots of offices, suburban areas, to make sure that there's a solid network and good access to services. At the heart of Australian employment services, we have strong activation policies. Job seekers that are on welfare payments are compelled to participate in employment services. They have activity requirements that they must meet in order to qualify for income support. They're things such as looking for work, attending appointments with their provider, and undertaking courses and training that is going to help them to get a job. They also have what we call mutual obligations. Probably the biggest mutual obligation activity we have in Australia is participation in a program called Work for the Dole, where people are required to work around 25 hours a week in exchange for their unemployment benefit in a organisation that provides services for the community on a non-commercial basis. So that might be working with charities in things like opportunity shops, so second-hand shops that they use to raise revenue to support underprivileged people in the community. Job seekers are strongly monitored and measured on meeting their compliance, and if they don't meet their compliance, they can have their income supports affected. Job seekers coming into employment services, anyone applying for income support payment approaches Centrelink, which is our government agency that manages income support. When they make contact with Centrelink, they are immediately given a questionnaire, a screening instrument called the Job Seeker Classification Instrument, and referred into employment services. Excuse me. Sorry about that. So that classification instrument helps to identify which program is going to suit the person to meet their needs, and it also determines what funding level the person comes into employment services at. So those with more complex needs get a higher level of service and higher fees are attached. There's three main programs in the Australian employment service landscape. Job Active is the largest program. It is our probably many universal program. It accounts for about 600,000 job seekers at any given point in time. The other program is Disability Employment Services. It's a specialist program for people who have need for specialist intervention because disability is their main barrier to work. So not everyone with a disability would go into that program, only those that require that specialised assistance. One of the features of that program is that after the employment service provider places the person, they can work with that person to support them to keep their employment for as long as is needed. So some people have been in that program and have been getting support after placement for 2 decades. So it's not a time-limited service. One of the benefits of that is that providers can work with those people with disability to make sure that they don't just sustain work, but they advance in career. So again, that's another area where using labour market information is really valuable in terms of helping people to engage in lifelong learning in work and make career choices and training choices that help them to progress and advance. The other program that we have is the Community Development Program, which services remote Australia. It primarily services the needs of our Indigenous Australians, our First People, and it deals with delivering services in remote areas which have very thin and sometimes non-existent labour market. So using labour market information in these areas is about how we actually help to inform job creation, looking at strategies that can help build commercial businesses to service communities and create employment for its members. With this, alongside these three major programs, there's a range of smaller specialist programs and complementary programs, of which the vocational education and training sector and apprenticeship sector are major partners that come together with employment services to deliver strategic responses to labour market demands. There's also a number of specialty programs for different cohorts of job seekers who have particular needs. Time to Work, for example, is for Indigenous job seekers about to be released from prison, to make sure that they have a transitional plan that sees them come out of prison, engaging in work preparation, and hopefully move into work so that we can reduce return to prison in the longer term. Career assistance, transition assistance, is a relatively new program that's really focused on the needs of mature age job seekers who are particularly displaced because of low digital literacy skills. So that is an important new program that's come into play because of the rapid advancement of technology, and we're seeing that transform the world of work. Skills for Education and Employment is a program for people from multicultural backgrounds who need to develop language and literacy skills to be able to compete in the Australian labour market. I won't go through all of those, but it gives you an idea that we have those major programs, and then it has connections with specialty programs, and the providers work together in partnership to achieve the outcomes. And again, those local strategies are really important, and particularly those that bring skill development. So the education and training sector, the employment service providers and employers together, and particularly developing demand-led initiatives to address skill shortages are particularly effective and very much informed by labour market information. As I said, in terms of the job seeker activation, there is that strong compliance framework. It's important just for me to flag too that in our system we have a work first policy. So whilst we're planning with individuals around their individual needs, there is an expectation that people will take the first suitable job that comes their way. So there is a strong policy that people aren't picking and choosing their jobs. And because of that, one of the big areas that we use labour market information is also working with people to understand how to articulate and move through the labour market and progress. So if we're looking at working with someone to get them into an immediate job, which isn't their preferred area of work, we work with them to say, getting into this will give you these skills, these experience, and this is what you need to move to the next job and the next job, and this is how you get to what is ultimately your dream job. Look, as I'm talking, if people have questions or I need to slow down or clarify anything, please don't hesitate to stop me and flag me as we go, so that I can make sure it is the messages are as clear as possible. As I said earlier, with the job seeker compliance framework, there is strong monitoring, and people are required to report their activities on a regular basis, and they'll get demerit points. And if you see in that circle, people get a tick if they're meeting their requirements. They get warnings if they're heading towards a financial penalty, and if they've accrued a number of demerits. That could be they didn't turn up to their employment service provider, they missed an interview, they didn't attend a training program that they were referred to. Then they can lose their benefits or have for a period of time, or they can have them cancelled, and then they lose income support immediately. So whilst we have this strong compliance, and it is a work first, fundamentally all employment services work with individuals to try to work with them to develop a plan of agreed activities to assist them with prepare and find work. Those activities are also designed to help build the skills that will let people keep a job once they've got it. So it's about focusing on making sure employment is sustainable. The sorts of things that would be commonly included in all plans would be things like job search requirements. We have specific requirements that job seekers look for a particular number of jobs in any month. In Australia, it's about 15 to 20 job applications must be submitted every month. They have to attend their appointments with their provider. The training courses that are agreed to be undertaken, personal assistance that the person may need to undertake, and some of these activities are voluntary, but that might be attending counselling for substance abuse or other issues, and participating in any of the mutual obligation requirements such as work for the dole. Now, in this process, it's really important in individual planning. As I said, the basis of individual planning should be evidence-based approaches. It's imperative that we use labour market information to guide the discussion with the person to ensure that where we're giving them activities, those activities are likely to lead to employment. One of the constant battles is making sure that, you know, referral to an education and training program isn't training for training's sake, but it aligns to the labour market demand and the skills needs of employers. So job seekers see, you know, that there's hope at the end of the tunnel, that they're participating in this for a purpose. That purpose is aligned to what goals they have themselves. Pardon me. Just will note too, when job seekers come into employment services, as I said before, and they get they have the job seeker information classification instrument conducted with providers. When they arrive in employment services, we have lots of information about those job seekers, and we have lots of information available to us about the employment service caseload. So there is a whole assessment process that comes into play. So we have the classification system when they come in, which, as I said earlier, allocates the streaming level and funding level. There's additional assessments that may be undertaken, specialist assessments, such as around capacity to work, especially for people with disability. So that information is coming in. Now, to complement that information, and sorry, just on the job seeker classification instrument, you can see that the information is very diverse. So we get lots of information about the person background. So things like what education they have, what vocational qualifications that they have, how well they can read and write and comprehend English, you know, their cultural background, their Indigenous status, how far they live from a local labour market. So what their transport options are, those sorts of things. All of these factors are statistically proven to help predict the likelihood that an individual might be long-term unemployed. So working with these sorts of factors about our caseload informs the sorts of local strategies that providers may put in. So they can analyse their caseload data to look at if there's local strategies to deal with specific issues. For example, access to transport is a significant issue in Australia, particularly in some of our regional areas. So many providers have developed a range of strategies to and help job seekers getting into employment. So, for example, a number of providers have actually started driving schools to help people develop the skills to drive cars and get their driver licence. from all sorts of backgrounds. There's others that have worked out community transport sharing strategies so that they've got carpooling sorts of situations. So job seekers can work with each other to make sure they can get to the jobs in the local area. But there's a range of ways that caseload data can be used to inform strategies and development. That's complemented and accessible to employment service providers through our employment services system. So every employment service, every frontline worker will be interacting and entering data on the employment services system every day. I think in recent data we're told there's something like 6 million transactions in the system on a daily basis. So this is the largest database in the Southern Hemisphere. It contains a very rich supply of information about the clients we're actually working with. It can give us information reports about the types of clients that are getting jobs, the sorts of industries they're getting job in. You can analyse this data to work with what strategies you've delivered have delivered the best outcome for clients. For example, you know, how you partner with employers and training providers to develop solutions. You know, is that leading to more jobs? Is that strategy actually effective? So using all of this information with broader labour market information is really important to make sure that you're benchmarking your strategies. You don't just do things because you always have. You're doing them because you know they work. Sometimes something that's worked may stop working. You may need to refresh, renew. So it's really important that we're not only thinking about external labour market information, but we're thinking about the information we have that we can use alongside that to make sure we're doing the best that we can. And we're very lucky to have the range of tools that we have in Australia that can provide lots of reports at our fingertips. But even prior to having this sort of database, many of the providers created their own and used sort of information throughout their own performance to make sure that they were continually improving their service delivery. So in terms of labour market information more broadly in Australia, so not just what we have in employment services, we have a range of labour market information data available to us across Australia. We have a number of agencies who participate in data collection, and we're very fortunate that there is a range of strategies in place to make sure that data is collated, analysed and presented in usable, easy to use reports and data cues for us to work with, and particularly for our frontline staff in employment services and education training, that makes that data accessible to job seekers and students. So it's making sure that data is presented in a way that's friendly and it's also presented in a way that's inspiring and positive for people. It's about highlighting opportunities. One of the big threats in terms of using labour market information with job seekers is making sure that it doesn't discourage people. It's very easy for people when they look at labour market information, and I'll go through in a minute some of the practical things that we do with job seekers and people considering study pathways, is that the information is used to inform and guide, but you know, it can be overwhelming for some people, and they can just see it as signs that they're not going to get a job, and you don't want to discourage. So my number one thing is, you know, making sure you use good data, making sure you use data from reliable sources, and making sure you deliver it in a way which is actually empowering and positive. helping to help people make good choices about what they do and about the practices they deliver. So our data sets, we're very lucky. We have a range of national data sets, such as the work by our Australian Bureau of Statistics. They're doing regular measurements of many labour market factors. They also do special surveys from time to time and working through. So there's a rich amount of data about the labour market, people who are participating in work, their characteristics, a whole lot of things we can draw upon to inform our work. We have our census, obviously, is one of our biggest surveys that we do. We also have particular surveys for different cohorts. For example, we have an annual survey of people with disability and their participation in employment services and how they work. That's done nationally, to look at what are the strategies that are actually helping people with disabilities participate more fully in the Australian labour market. And we get lots of information from those sorts of reports about the sorts of things people find engaging about service, the strategies that people found most beneficial, the barriers that they experience and the experiences they have, particularly looking for work and interviews and interactions with employers, as well as the interactions in the workplace that can be threats to ongoing and stable employment. Again, so there's a rich diversity of information. It's not all numbers. There's lots of surveys of employers, what their experiences and thoughts are. So there's a rich tapestry there to draw on. In terms of the other types, there's lots of surveys and point-in-time surveys of labour market dynamics, projected growth overall in the labour market, broken down further into things such as skill shortages, areas where we've got oversupply of skilled workers. There's measures of vacancy index, just that month-to-month reporting on the numbers of vacancies. And that's quite an important one for employment services, because our performance is often aligned. There's a correlation between that and vacancies. And we use that information to make sure we're tracking well. If the vacancies are up and our performance is down, that's a clear message to us that it's our internal strategies that are a problem rather than a factor of the labour market. So again, you can see that it's important to be bringing different data and benchmarking as you go along. We have a National Centre for Vocational Education Research. They provide a range of data that's really informs education and training pathways, VET, apprenticeship services, and helps looking at those. So again, we've got that. We've also got our state government areas and have regional analysis data, as well as very local. And the local players, particularly local government for us, we have 3 levels of government. We have the Commonwealth government, we have state government, and then we have local government at the regional level, so in the small communities. And they're very engaged with the local business community and the local dynamics, and not only what's happening, but what they're projecting to happen. So maybe a business looking to relocate, they'll often offer incentives to those businesses to come to town. So they're a good way to get labour market information that might not come through on all of the other high-level reports. So for us, making sure that we form local and keep place-based strategy at the forefront is really important. And that's about making sure that we're connecting with all of the stakeholders. So local businesses, local chambers of commerce or trade associations, and doing environmental scan. So have those different levels of labour market information that you're using together to work through to make sure the frontline strategy is relevant. to the local labour market, where the person is most likely to look for a job. Or if they may also want to consider moving, which can be informed by that labour market information as well. But there's many players who produce reports and bulletins that are free and accessible in Australia. Industry bodies, financial institutions, business advocacy groups. So they're all in the mix, and making sure you pull together good selections to inform choice are there. In terms of the frontline users, we're very fortunate that there is a number of tools. So this information is translated into tools that we can direct job seekers to use, or support, or use with them. And I'm going to talk about them a little bit later on. So I'll skip over that for now. So, you know, I've given you a bit of an overview of employment services and touched on a few areas where we use labour market information data on a regular basis. But it's important to remember that, you know, it's not only just about the front line. Labour market information, evidence-based approaches is important across the entire board. You know, official policy, government policy should be based on good understanding of labour market information. Our range of complementary programs that I shared with you earlier, they've arisen from good analysis of those groups of job seekers who do not do as well in employment services as others. So from that, you know, their individual needs and maybe bespoke needs that they have as a group that other people in the system don't need are tailored for in developing these policy responses and program responses, such as Parents Next that we've got, which really looks at the support needs of single parents, and primarily women, transitioning back into the labour market. And again, it's about that cohort not doing employment service. It's also about using labour market information. So the government has used it to see women are underrepresented. Their participation rate is lower, and that there is huge economic benefit from providing services that actually help that group to better participate in the labour market. So that labour market information, together with the economic benefits, you know, that helps the government determine what it's actually going to invest in these services. Labour market information about where the skills are will inform government about what courses they're actually going to fund, how many they're going to fund, and where those courses will be funded to be delivered. So it's really about making sure that the strategies are informed so that you best align skills development, skills supply with skills demand, so that you're getting those comprehensive solutions coming together. Labour market information should be used to inform best practice, and that's at all levels. As a practitioner, I would measure my own performance. I would look how I'm using labour market information to say, am I doing my role as well as I could do? So I would look at the types of job seekers that I was placing my job seekers into, the types of industry that I was placing them into, and seeing how well does that reflect the labour market. And that's to look at, do I have particular strengths with particular groups of clients? Do I have particular strengths in preparing clients for particular industries? Do I have particular weaknesses? Those sorts of questions are the same questions you might ask for an office to say, are we doing the best we can? And it's not only what we're doing well, it's to say, what can we do to enhance our weaknesses? But it's evidence-based approaches. And again, it's doing strategies that know work and validating those strategies continue to work. Using labour market information in the interface with employers is increasingly important. Our employment service providers, as our many of our education and training services and apprenticeship services, are interacting with employers about their skill needs. Now, many employers will have a fixed picture of what they're looking for, what they want, what their demands are. making sure that you work with employers, again, on a solutions-based approach to highlight what is the skills supply that we have, what is the characteristics of job seekers and students coming in, to actually get business to think outside the box, to think about how they might be able to engage with talent and create opportunity for people that might have some gaps in terms of what they want, or how they could themselves as an organisation help to participate in the skill supply chain. For example, these sorts of approaches, working with employers on labour market information, but we've seen employers change their workforce diversity strategy. So they've looked at better ways to incorporate workplace flexibilities for parents, to better support people with disability in the workplace, because they realise if they want the skills that they need, then they have to think outside their traditional employment patterns. The other things that working with employers on these things, and it encourages them to think about things such as internships, work experience, trials that may help students undertaking qualifications to get some of that grounded experience that employers want when they graduate. So they're actually participating in the development of the skills, and it certainly places them in a good position then to be able to attract those same students once they've actually qualified and developed. Again, I'll just iterate that, we use labour market information most significantly at the individual level, providing sound advice and guidance to people on what their opportunities are, the sorts of threats and things that they should consider. Vocational choices are complex. People don't necessarily understand how to navigate the world of work. They don't necessarily understand the stepping stones that might be in a career pathway. So using labour market information in a positive way to inform choice for individuals and help guide and empower them is important, as I said earlier. Particularly now that we're working in an era where we're seeing the advancement of technology, automation, rapidly changing the world of work, making sure people have sound advice about the opportunities and threats in the labour market is really important, and working through that. And I say in that information is equally important, not only to the job seekers and students, but sometimes to their families and others who have a big influence on the decisions that they make and look forward. I think fundamentally what I think is really important to understand, and I'm sure you will all agree with me, that a commitment and motivation to pursue a certain pathway is really the critical factor in success. If an individual feels forced down a factor, if they're not genuinely committed, they have a much greater risk of falling off the pathway and not being successful at the end. That is a poor experience for the person, and that sort of experience can lead to further failure and pessimism about opportunities in the labour market, and it's a waste of investment and time that goes into all of these strategies. So really ensuring that we take a whole of person approach, that we're not just thinking about what the data tells us, that we're thinking about that in terms of understanding the individual is really important. So you're using that to guide people, but you really need to take a whole of person approach. If we want to make good choices, and I'll give you a little bit of an example, understanding the person's background, understanding what their goals are, their choices, helps to, together with labour market information, to package together a good choice. Unfortunately, I've seen a number of people that have been guided because of you know, they can do security work. They don't mind the thought of doing security work. They're referred to a security training program, but no one took into account that the person had a criminal conviction. So they've done a training program, but they're never going to qualify to work in the field because that's a preclusion from it. You must take a whole of person approach. It's the same as working with someone who has a physical limitation and can't do inherent requirements to the job, and that there are no ready adjustments or accommodations. If you actually don't take into account the whole person, all of their attributes and their aspiration, and their needs, short, medium and long term, labour market information alone won't help you to make a good choice. You have to pull those things together. For example, you might be guiding a student or a job seeker about undertaking a university degree. But if that student has immediate financial pressures, is at risk of homelessness, they're not going to be able to do that. So you need to think within their life circumstances, marrying it up with labour market information to make sure you can think of not only the immediate, but short, medium and long-term goals. Many of us don't start off in the job that we dream to. You know, using labour market information, understanding within industries and occupations how people can progress through jobs, works through. So, for example, if someone aspires to be a nurse, the university program is 3 years long in Australia. If someone has more immediate needs, and for example, it might be a sole parent who really can't commit to full-time study for 3 years, needs to think about, you know, their care of their children, they might go for an alternative route. They might start in our aged care or disability sector. It's a 6-month preparation program. It's a sector that allows flexible work opportunities, but it's also, once you're in that sector, it's relatively accessible to do additional units of study and qualifications and articulate into the nursing degree over a few years. It's an alternative pathway to the same destination. And that's incumbent on us to be able to guide people through that. People won't necessarily understand how they can, what we call career ladder or stepstone through jobs without having guidance and that sort of career guidance provided to them. So the other point I'd like to make about using labour market information and using it effectively is to make sure we're using a good range of information. It's very easy to, if you use a too narrow selection of data, that you can actually lead people to guide them to low, or they only themselves look at a few pieces of data, they might not get the full picture. So it's really important that people are thinking about the range of information that they can use about the labour market, properly informed choices. So I'm just going to go through some of the different types of information we use and reflect on how we use it in employment services, and also, again, highlighting some of the other tools that we have available to our practitioners. And that's not just employment services, that's our career teachers, people in education, across the board. These are publicly available, and they're also available to users themselves. So one of the things one of our common strategies is working with job seekers to build their understanding of how competitive the workforce really is, and the labour market. It's to prepare people to understand that their time in employment services, the things that they can do for themselves to increase their competitiveness for jobs. This is particularly an issue for many mature age job seekers who might have recently been displaced from work. We've particularly seen a lot of that, and, you know, like our automotive industry has recently undergone significant closure. We're no longer manufacturing cars in Australia. So we've had a workforce, many of whom are mature age, who've been long-term in an industry that no longer exists. And these workers often come into employment services not understanding the competitiveness of the labour market, not understanding where their skills fit in, but they've got great confidence in work ethic, their employability. So getting them in the right mindset to build on those strengths that they have to make sure that they're competitive is really important. Otherwise, quite often people will just keep applying for jobs and not realising why they're not getting them. So again, it's showing people where the vacancies are, the types of jobs, and it then gives us an opportunity to look at what we would consider their transferable skills and seeing where does that fit with where there's growth, and helping people understand how their skills may relate to a whole new sector and working with that, and also then being able to look at the demand within that. So the vacancy report is a report that comes out every month, and it's published online as part of our labour market information portal by the Department of Jobs, and I'll go more into the portal as we go along. The other thing is that these reports can go down into industry levels. So if we have people that are, have an interest in working in a particular area, we can go through with them, understanding the vacancies that might exist in a certain area. And, we're very fortunate that we've got from employer surveys, we've not only got information on the number of vacancies, but how many vacancies are filled, how many applicants they get per vacancy, how many get interviewed, and, the percentage where they attracted no suitable vacancies, so applicants, which tells us where the skill shortages and the gaps are. So using that sort of information, we might work with someone coming in who's got a general interest to try and then sway them with the evidence in front of them to something we're in skill shortage. So rather than maybe looking at a pathway to being a chef, they might consider a pastry cook or a baker or a butcher where there is clear skill shortages and there is ongoing demand expected in those sectors. The other area where we can use labour market information to build that understanding, and this is also about a bit of reality testing with people, is and not only about finding a job but keeping a job long term, is looking at what the skill level requirements that are increasingly being required across the labour market. So this is this sort of data, as we see here, really clearly shows that the projected growth in jobs in the Australian labour market are for high skill level jobs. The proportion, and we've got timeline series, the proportion of low skill employment is declining year upon year. It is in rapid decline. So when we're talking with people who maybe still at school, maybe considering career pathways, it's about working with them to think about their skill level, but it's also about engaging them to think beyond getting into work and thinking about adopting lifelong learning and the importance of maintaining their skills when they're in work to make sure that they keep working, keep pace with the demands of the labour market, which is changing. So engaging people in these discussions, it can be empowering and have a long-term benefit for them, and getting them to take a bit of charge on that. In terms of this labour market information, there's lots of analysis that this information is used for to inform our practice. We know, for example, across our sector, that if we want to improve someone's employability to the optimum level, that we really need to look at Cert 3. So Cert 3 employment in Australia, people with Cert 3 qualifications, do better in employment than even with Cert 2, skill level 2 with an advanced diploma. So we know that We might have to stepstone people through lower skill training to build them up to Cert 3. But if we're going to do training that's going to make the biggest difference to employment, that's where we need to aim. And that's been relatively unchanged in the Australian labour market over recent years. That's really the level that we need to be pitching on. So working with individuals as well, in terms of understanding the labour market and the competition, it's also about using, as I said, that rich array of data. It's also by looking at some of the surveys with employers so they can understand of understanding of how employers are recruiting. So what are the ways that the strategies they should use in their job search to get the best results. So, for example, this survey, which was done of the disability and aged care sector, clearly outlines that word of mouth and direct approaches for disability and aged care are a huge way that this sector actually attracts talent. So if people are only applying for jobs on the website, they're missing out on many other areas to get it. Again, with this sort of data and analysis, which takes the competition of the labour market down to a sector level, we know that within community services and health, disability care and aged care, which are Australia's largest growing sectors, there's aged care has twice the applicants in disability services. So if I am skilled in and got qualifications in care, which are in Australia can have some level of transferability, I might be better to pitch my application at disability care than aged care. So it gives me information about, doing the same type of work within the two areas, that there's ways to move. So again, it's using that labour market information to really work with people, build their understanding and knowledge so that they can make those good decisions. It's also really important that we're talking, using labour information, market information to work with people so that they have an understanding of what employers are looking for in the labour market. In this time in Australia, a qualification is just not enough. Employers are looking for much more. They really looking for over and above the technical skills. They have a strong desire for employability skills, things such as teamwork, pardon me, teamwork, problem solving, ability to work with lots of different people from different backgrounds, that they can self-manage themselves. We do have an entire employability skills framework here that goes through those core requirements and the sorts of things that people need to be able to demonstrate to an employer that they've got the capacity to deliver. So look, and then the sorts of personal qualities that employers were looking for. So this information is used to work with job seekers to think about, if we have a look at your history now, what are ways that you could demonstrate that to a employer, and then we might look at things that they've done as a hobby, things they've done in volunteer work, things that they've done in other jobs, but make sure that they can display and demonstrate this information to employers to meet what they want. So using labour market information like this, you're really empowering the job seeker to think about what's going to make a difference to win that job. And again, it can help within decision making about different areas that they might target too. And again, it also can, particularly in that preparation, it might prompt people to understand that if they've got a gap in a particular area, and particularly when students are studying, things that they can do ex-curricular that help them to be more ready and more competitive when they finalise their courses. So taking on voluntary work while they're in courses, looking at opportunities for internships, those sorts of things. You know, if they understand that the qualification itself isn't going to be enough, they might be encouraged to do those extra things outside to make sure that they can be the most competitive they can be. So all of these tools I've shown you are part of what we've got called is the Labour Market Information Portal. So this is a central hub. We're very fortunate to have this, which in which providers at any one of the public, you know, it's open there, and you've got the email address on the screen, so you can feel free to go and have a play with it if you like. That you can get a range of information, a labour market information that you can use to work with job seekers. So on the front page here, this is just some basic information about employment services. So this allows, for example, an employer to go in and have a look and see the number of people that are currently unemployed, which potentially they might have access to. But there's many other pages with issues on trends, data analysis, industry sector reports that you can play with. So it's a great one-stop shop for us to get this information. But again, if you haven't got it, there's other ways to pull this information together yourself. Again, with labour market information, that's in terms of the employment services caseload in there. There's the Australian caseload as snapshot. So for providers actually understanding how their caseload matches up with the national average is really important. They can look at, you know, if they have a higher percentage of youth maybe than others or mature age, and that should drive their employment service strategies. So to design strategies that are particularly targeted groups that they've got above average proportion on in the caseload. But again, with caseload data, I think it's really important to remember that caseload data is an important part of the puzzle, but if you use caseload data only, you're not going to have rounded strategies. You need to use the external labour market information to make sense of that. And one of the biggest opportunities is to actually understand the gap between, you know, what the skills gap is between the people you're working with and what the demands are in the labour market. So actually understanding that where you need to work to actually fill the pathways, or the guidance with students in terms of where they're currently at, where they using projected data is really important in the current era of transformation. You know, in this day and age, we have students starting courses, but by the time they're getting to their final year, a lot of what they've learnt in their early years is already becoming redundant, or there is new skill requirements coming into play that they haven't acquired through the course because of the timing that they're in. And look, across the board, digital literacy is seen as a foundational skill for all our job seekers in Australia now, as it is for practitioners ourselves to be able to utilise the tools available to us. And I'd have to say data literacy and being able to use labour market information is also a core skill that we see that we need in our sector. So using the labour market information, we are able to work through and get snapshot information such as this graph about what the top growth areas are for the next 5 years. And we can work through this to work with people and saying where are the jobs, what sort of jobs, and going through that. But, you know, again, the top growth jobs is only part of the puzzle. So an example of how it's important to use clusters of information to get a full picture, you know, growth in jobs doesn't necessarily mean the full level of job opportunities. So jobs come from turnover as well as new work. So this is an old graph, but it's the most recent that they've done on this particular topic that I wanted to use to illustrate. But if we look at our ageing workforce, we've done a workforce profiling by mature age workers. We could see here, this is going back, I think healthcare and social assistance service has a high proportion of mature age workers. That continues to be the same trend. But so that if you look at the growth for that sector, you'll not necessarily have a full appreciation of the opportunities because it's part of its turnover. So it's not that the sector is growing in number necessarily, but there'll still be opportunities there. So it's important to look at different elements of data together to get the full picture. Now, in Australia, and we're quite a large continent and country, we have around 24 million people. Our landscape covers 7.6 million kilometres, and our population density is very low. We have 3 people per kilometre squared. So for us, it's very important that we consider labour market information not only on an aggregate basis or on a national basis, not even just a state. It's really taking it down to regional and very local areas so that it makes sense. So you still need to understand where overall industry trends are happening and those things, which there may be a lag affecting the local area. So you still know the trends, but you've really got to focus on the local to place-based strategies to actually be able to deliver effective frontline service and really matching skill supply and demand at the local level. So just as it's important to be individual, it's important to be local and think at multiple levels when delivering services or when designing overall strategies and policies. Now, with the labour market information portal, we can take that aggregate information and we can drill down quite extensively. So, for example, if we've looked at we looked at the overall growth, this is just a selection of graphs. This is total industry by state and territory, and then we've got a breakdown of where the top 15 regions, so where the most jobs are locally. And again, when we're using this information to find out where the jobs are, it's also to make sure that the information you got, because local areas can go against the trends. There can be boutique industries that are doing very strong on a local basis, and we need to make sure that we're at that local level still managing supply of skills. And in some cases, we need that information to actually advocate to government and policy because there might be overall no skill shortages on an overall level, but particular industry sectors affecting local economies are suffering if there's not good supply of an investment in things like local education and training to support those sectors. So one of the areas, for example, in Australia that's in line is manufacturing, and this is a little bit of a snapshot, but it's a very patchwork situation. So you can see on the left hand of the screen in the orange there's areas where manufacturing is in significant decline and going backwards quite strongly. We've still got strong sectors in 2 of our states, and on the right side of the thing we've got the local areas where those job opportunities in that manufacturing sector are the actual strongest. So it's a good way not just to take notice of the headline issues, but make sure you're looking in. And for what we know in Australia is we have some sectors of our manufacturing sector that are doing very well in advanced manufacturing. They've transitioned businesses to new approaches, new innovation, and a big threat for them is a poor supply of skills. So we can use that to actually work with both state and Commonwealth governments to advocate that they ensure that in making the big pictures in terms of investment, education and training and skill supply, that they don't forget the local scenarios that are often significant businesses and often lifeblood to local economies. You know, there's some areas in manufacturing where we've got some very successful providers, businesses in advanced technology that are now doing wonderful at export, and they're really going against trend, and their situation needs to be encouraged so that we can actually develop more of that innovation rather than strangle them through loss of skills. And for Australia, the issue is if we can't supply those skills, then people will look for offshore opportunities. So we need to be able to foster that local business. Again, top 15. And then at the local area, we see the areas where manufacturing is declining quickest. So again, these are the drill downs that we have. Now, ensuring that people understand those areas where you're looking, you know, we've got decline and we've got rapid decline happening. You know, many people who are in a situation where they have to consider, or they find themselves in looking for employment, or they're in employment and looking at the need to change vocation because they can see it coming. This information about what's happening in the decline is really important to pull people into the picture. Actually talk to them about, you know, someone might come out of manufacturing and there might be another job coming up. But it's really important to work with them to let them to understand there's another job and you might get another job quickly now, but you need to think about skills for long term, because the likelihood if you're in an area of decline, unless you're with an employer that's, you know, advancing and growing, that you're at high risk of another period of displacement from work. So we've seen people who've moved from employer to employer, and they've all been short term because they've ended up having lots of employers that are in decline and end up closing or making redundancies and restructuring. So the earlier we get to think to people in areas of decline to rethink career direction, what they can do, think about education and training options that might upskill them to be in the strongest part of the sector or to change sectors, is really important. In terms of practice, it's really important that anyone working with students or employers has a good understanding about industries and the different sectors, and can work with tools and information so that you can think about what's transferable skills, and you can think about and again, thinking about the whole of person. It's looking at using labour market information, working with the individual holistically to see whether or not there is good direction, because it could be a life phase change for a person. So what we see is for many mature age job seekers, for example, they've had their period of time where they've worked to bring up their family, to buy a home and to get settled, and now they're looking for a transition before they go into a retirement. So they want a different experience and a different outcome from work. So satisfaction from work can often be a higher priority. And, you know, what we find is that people might not necessarily want to go back into the same area, but they've got a whole lot of transferable skills from hobbies and life that they can take into the workforce. And what we find is a lot of people, as they're maturing, have experience of having to be carers, either through family circumstances like ageing parents, they've obviously bringing up their own children, that sort of thing. So they have a new experience about working in different sectors. They might have come from manufacturing, and where they might be heading at this time in their life is something like personal care in disability, aged care or childcare. So again, it's working with the data, showing people, you know, the industry they've come from, what the prospects are, showing them what prospects growth areas are, and drawing on their individual characteristics and aspirations to find what's going to motivate them to put them on a pathway. Again, just a snapshot. We have also another interactive database, which is accessible through the same portal, which takes that information on place-based on industry down to a much smaller level. It's a much smaller communities than the other one. So the emphasis in Australia on place-based, particularly when we're given our regional areas, is really important. About half our unemployment in Australia is based in regional areas, and that's where actually building the best alignment between skills and demand, so tailoring, guiding the supply of new labour to consider those areas that are available is the most prevalent. So that's just another tool that we're lucky to have. And again, there's a whole range of tools and information that we have available to us, and that you may have available through a number of sources that help people to understand the industry that they might be seeking to get into, and then opportunities to drill a little bit further to occupations, as I've said before. So, we've got detailed charts about which occupations, not only which sectors, but which occupations are actually growing within these sectors, and information, as I'm about to show you, about which occupations are actually declining. So it's really important to be working with people on their choices now as they prepare for occupations, that they're not preparing for areas that might be subject to decline because of automation and jobs that are basically disappearing from our landscape. So again, we can drill into different jobs, and you can see here that sort of office management, personal assistant jobs in here are really declining. There's automation and technology has really helped to make that less labour intensive, and while it's still attracting and employing people in those roles, the roles aren't disappearing. Opportunities for positions in that are rapidly declining. We can talk about the same things in the legal sector. So once upon a time, going through education and training to qualify to be a legal clerk would have been a secure and sustainable area of employment. But that area of employment, that professional area of employment, is rapidly being consumed by automation now. So, keeping that forward-facing approach to sectors and occupation to make sure people don't start on a journey that leads them nowhere is really important. Pardon me. So again, using the same sort of data, and this one here we've got, which I thought might have been interesting to you, we've got good demand in our education and training sector for professionals in here, but there's the employment growth is quite different for different areas. So, for example, if someone's interested in tech, their best area, the best growth area moving forward is early childhood teaching. There's so if you're looking at guiding someone and areas they might specialise in, different components, elective units they might undertake in education and training that might give them a competitive edge over others. It's really important to drill down into occupational sectors rather than just looking at industries and high-level data. It's taking it down to the individual. The other issue when we're looking at all this projected data, and again, this is where I keep coming back to using data in clusters and not to rely on too narrow a field of data, is it's really important to keep that forward perspective. And when we're looking at projected vacancies and outcomes, it's important to understand how many people might already be on the road to qualifications. So it's not just being reactive to a potential or projected growth. And what we've experienced in Australia, where we've had some skill shortages and projected growth, everyone's got on board, and, you know, lots of people have taken it up, and then we've ended up with a skill glut. So it's equally important not to only look at what's projected, but to look at what is the labour supply chain. How many people have we got coming through the system? How many people are going to be ready to meet that demand as it moves forward? And look, I think when we're looking at this sort of data, and this is our National Centre for Vocational Education Resource, provide a lot of data and reports that we can see how we're going through education and training. We can benchmark ourselves in there. Is you know, it also shows us, you know, where what the commencement and completion rates are, and how that training is actually translating into commencements into industry. So they're the sorts of things that we look for and work with, and to, you know, then that gives rise to research about what is the gap between the qualification and getting a job, and what can we do better. What are the reasons students drop out? So in our medical training, for example, the highest dropout rate for students going through didn't occur till about third year. And it aligned with the first experience that medical students had with direct care with patients. So prior to that, it had been textbook learning, it had been theory, it had been research. When our students hit the patient and the reality of what it was going to be interacting with patients, many of them decided to change fields. So that's something good to understand, to make sure the selection processes are actually more refined, changing the way that we actually make sure people understand professions and the reality of jobs, better investment and better return out of education training system where we have you know, good commencement to completion outcomes. So you can use labour market information, as I said, in many different ways, but importantly, no matter what field you're in, you can use some of these things to benchmark how you're going, you know, and work through from there. Now, the other issue, and I harped on a lot about using information in very positive ways to get people to guide choice, to make sure people feel empowered and that it is a choice, that significant life decisions like education and training and employment are about, you know, the person and their aspiration. The worst thing that we can do to people is fire a whole lot of data and numbers at them and tell them that says what they should do. You know, it's about a guiding approach and an exploration approach. And the thing, we're pretty fortunate, and there's lots of tools available on the internet that are freely available to help people guide themselves in terms of working through aspirations and career guidance. In Australia, we have what's called Job Outlook, which incorporates a range of information, but underpinning in that, so it allows people to go in, it allows them to have a look at what their strengths, aspirations, the industry, you know, they can develop a bit of a career profile and then test it against labour market information. So that's within the tool itself. So it's not about always giving person and firing information at people. It's about actually getting people to think about their career, take ownership, and build the skills to research their own career. And again, they're skills that can take them through life, particularly for students, getting them to understand the reality of the occupation, the profession that they might be training for and what's happening in it. It's about feeding into lifelong learning. So for me, it's really important to think that it's not only about practitioners giving information, it's about teaching people how to find out for themselves and engaging them in that as something they can do ongoing through their career to make sure that they stay in touch with the needs of their sector. Again, just a couple of snippets from this tool. So it helps people drill down into specific jobs. It gives them information about the sorts of average weekly pay they can expect, whether there's strong future growth, and the skill level they need to be successful. And you can drill into these and work a bit more. So, you know, that self-exploration and coming up with informed decisions and getting people really committed to their pathway, whether it's in education or employment, can be really aided by these sorts of tools. Similarly, we have an annual publication that's put together. That's really, it focuses on, you know, being usable. And it's one that's often used in our classrooms and in career guidance to get people to start thinking about the world of work early. It's downloadable off the internet. So this pulls together all the sorts of data I've talked to you about. It does the local, it does state, it does national, it does areas of growth, areas in decline. It really gets people thinking about the sorts of skills employers want, as well as those employabilities or soft skills and attributes they're looking for. So this is a resource that's updated annually with all of the information, and it certainly highlights trends and things available going through. Again, it's an annual document, but the website is providing more of data and current information. So much of the things on the website are surveys and new data that comes through monthly. So you've still got that currency information. Again, just another things, you know, it does really, this document and this resource focuses people on looking forward, looking where real jobs are. So, you know, getting people to think a little bit more strategically about how technology is changing the way we work, the need for technology skills regardless of what sort of jobs that we're coming through. That fundamental digital literacy is one of the biggest barriers that people can have to employment now. You know, so working with people on those sort of things, using user-friendly information, things that they can relate to. The infographics are a wonderful way to convey that to people, and potentially people can create these sort of things at a local office, and many of our members do that, and they might do, you know, our labour market and a bit of a snapshot about their local area, the jobs you can expect to do here, the jobs that are in growth, the jobs that are in demand. Doing it in a simple sheet like this, that you can have it and have a discussion and work with job seekers or prospective students on the spot to get a feel for it. This sort of information too, and remembering that many job seekers might have vocational aspirations and goals that are, you know, they really want to pursue. And even if they're not available locally, having information about where the jobs are is a really important way to encourage better labour mobility in our labour market. Australians, our labour market, we have poor worker mobility. Australia has a high rate of home ownership. People are very attached to community and their local area. So people, on the whole, are not likely to move for work. These sorts of infographics and this sort of information can really help to build the notion of mobility and important, and particularly when we're working with people at the beginning of their careers, to think about how they might move, you know, how mobile they might be willing to be to get into their dream career, and get that decision making and that thinking happening early to work through. But again, those user-friendly approaches are really important. And I've been going for a while now, so I'm nearly finished. I just wanted to say that, you know, the labour market, the statistics, the reports don't replace good labour market intelligence. Being connected on the ground, working with your community, stakeholders, understanding local dynamics that might be outside of the trends, I think, very important. Again, these are all things you should be using together to inform good guidance and working. One of the really strong benefits of good local intelligence is identifying opportunities for early intervention. So there can be emerging trends, opportunities and threats. You know, if you're getting to know your local employer base, you know, your local manufacturers, and you know that one of your local manufacturers is thinking about moving their operations to another centre or offshore, you can start preparing for the decline in that. You can start thinking about the strategies that you put in place. You know, we have a good opportunities to partner with employers who are thinking of restructuring and that going through significant redundancies, to partner and do early intervention with their workforce to start preparing them for their next job well before they are going out the door. The most difficult circumstances happens when a workforce is displaced suddenly. And that has a huge impact on local economies in some cases. So if there's a way that you're partnering, you're collecting data and you're developing that intelligence locally, you can actually help to make sure that local economies don't get as big a shock from those sorts of closures and things as possible. Not to mention that the individual circumstances, people suddenly put into redundancy and unemployment, the implications for them, their family and community, like it's beyond the economic, it's the social fabric as well. And you know, with the labour market intelligence, you know, that's as a legitimate part of informing your strategies and your practice as data is. If you have good reliable networks where you're getting good sound information coming through from your local stakeholders, you know, that's as important as data being collected by large agencies. But it's important to have a systematic way of making sure you're collecting the data and you're clarifying, you're understanding where the intelligence is coming from. You know, is it coming from what your stakeholder is seeing in buttons, or is it because they were told from someone else who was told from someone else? So you're always checking your sources. You need to always check the reliability of your information, whether it's data. You know, because someone prints a report doesn't mean the data's correct. You need to always go through and make sure you're with a reliable stakeholder. But it's also about making sure the stakeholder information you get is reliable data as well. And that local intelligence really enables you to do the practical, place-based, evidence-driven responses on the ground. For us as a representative body, working with all levels of governments and doing advocacy, it gives us some documented experiences and realities that we can use to advocate to government. And I'll give you an example, a quick example. When the global financial crisis hit, initially all of the big data was saying there was no change, Australia wasn't being affected. We were able to do granular data through our network and said, of the job seekers you've been placing in employment, how many have lost their job recently? We could see how many people have been, you know, the last one employed or the first one often put into unemployment. We could find out how many vacancies have been cancelled. We found out a whole range of information which really triggered for government, and we could evidence all of that. We gave that to government, which said you need to act fast, not later. And they were able to put in a whole lot of extra supports for people experiencing redundancy. And we had a great early intervention, which is one of the reasons Australia did really well through the global financial crisis and was one of the few countries not to go to risk. So again, about the local and the network and business intelligence, it can be extremely powerful. The other thing is using labour market intelligence. It's not just all about your clients, your students or your job seekers, it's about your practice and your organisation. Labour market information, using that and other sources of data, including your data, can actually help you identify some problems you might have. you know, why is it that we're not doing as well for our Indigenous job seekers as we're doing for people with disability? Or, you know, and it gets you to actually formulate questions. Why is there a gap? What is there? Helps to direct you to think about where you need to take action. And it's about coming up with evidence-based solutions. Many of the times people will see a problem and they'll throw in strategies, they'll throw in investment, but they're not actually getting to the cause because they haven't taken the time to really work with all of those things to find it. So using your labour market information to identify what the challenges might be, and then drilling into that to find the genuine causes and trialling things is of great benefit to continuous improvement. In Australia, some of the examples of that is we have an investment approach where we're trialling different strategies with different cohorts where we've identified they don't do as well getting access to the labour market. And we're using a range of pilots through what we call try, test and learn to evaluate different things using our investment in welfare to actually identify those strategies which are most likely to get people from welfare into work. The Department of Employment and Jobs is developing a range of pilot projects, works with providers to come up with local propositions, local strategies that can be tested. Successful models then can be considered for scale up and sharing in other areas and working through. And again, I've talked a little bit, NESA itself uses a range of labour market information to make sure that we've got well-defined and well-targeted strategies to support our sector and the recruitment and attraction of skills for our sector, as well as the development of skills in our sector. The other thing is we often use that labour market information to break down myths about our sector in terms of the profile of our workers, what we need, and the sorts of people we employ and what they do. So that's really important for us to be able to support the workforce sector, is to be able to defend and promote its capability. Look, so just in very big summary, I know I've talked at you for a long, long time, the importance to use reliable data is there. So check your data source. Don't just grab the first thing that comes up. There's lots of data that we have in Australia that is very selective. It's biased towards a particular viewpoint or philosophy or to support a particular industry or sector. So making sure that you're picking good, reliable, valid data is really important. Using multiple data types to form that big picture. So it's really easy to be, you know, a bit overwhelmed by what seems to be a significant data point, but to miss something else. And, you know, then your strategies or the guidance you give to students in education and employment may not be, you know, the optimum guidance that you could have given. So it's, again, it's about keeping it comprehensive and thinking of all of the different pictures that you might need to put together, the bits of the puzzle. And it's also thinking big picture. You need to be aware of what's happening overall in terms of trends, you know, so thinking nationally and state. But it's about making sure that your actions are also very much embedded in the local. So taking all three levels is really important. And the emphasis on the different three levels will be different depending on the nature of what your role is and what you're doing. But for most people doing direct work with job seekers, students or employers, local is imperative. You know, and it's about using that labour market information to inform choice. It's not to direct, it's not to tell, it's informing choice and empowering people in their decisions, because that, at the end of the day, they're the decisions that they'll be most committed to. Getting people to guide themselves, teaching them the research skills, how to find information, how to interpret it, in itself is is building their employability skills, but it's setting them up to have the skills to consider and manage their career for their lifetime. So it's not about just feeding the data to them, it's also about working with, partnering with them to find out for themselves and teaching them those skills. You know, an employment plan or a career guidance plan to get people to employment of their choice needs to be evidence informed. It needs to have that labour market information, and it needs to talk to people about how they get competitive in their chosen field. Again, qualifications aren't enough, and there's lots of work people can do, lots of strategies they can undertake while they're in education and training to develop those other employability skills. So don't just stick to the occupation and the job. It's about, what are employers looking for? How are they finding their people? What do they value above the qualification? And making sure you're at the top of the chain in terms of competitiveness for a job. You know, you needed to think about your overall strategies for organisations. You know, it's not just working individually. You need to think about partnerships that you work with that are going to make your service stronger, and that are available to your practitioners to draw upon when they're working with individuals. So that, for example, is your partnerships with things like vocational education and training, or community service sector, and working through for that. You know, it's looking at your cohorts, who you do well for and who you don't, making sure it's there. And using that labour market information to stay informed, stay connected, and making sure what you're delivering is staying in tune with what the labour market actually wants. You need to be validating that all the time. You have a good understanding. You know, you're preparing people to the skills that the labour market and employers actually need for their business. So that, I feel like I've talked forever, and I'm sorry if I've overwhelmed you all. You know, and I'm happy if anyone wants to contact me afterwards, but I'm really keen to see if you've got questions or reflections that we can talk to. I hope that was informative for you. I hope that some of your needs.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
so
very
anybody?
Much. Yes, I think I'm sure there are a lot of questions, but thank you for very rich information that you shared with us. I think we learned a lot, and that's why I don't want to interrupt, because it's a lot of good information, and I think you know, every one of us will bring a lot of things home. Let me just start before the rest asking questions. I just want to see, because the systems of employment systems in Australia is very different than what's maybe existing in this region in Southeast Asia. And one of them is the interplay between governments and also private. And you said that you have about 250 kind of employment services all over the nation. And also you can see that there is a National Bureau of Statistics. You have, I think, other ministries also supporting. When we try to reflect this and then looking into the type of information, looking into, for example, like in regards to LMI, we look at the past data. For example, like the National Bureau of Statistics, I'm sure they're producing a lot of past data about you know, what happened in the past few years. And then maybe in this case, the employment services and also government agency produce also the current data, so that between the job seekers and employers, they can interact, communicate, and at the end they can link. And then also the future, the forecasting that I think you mentioned is very, very important. So how could you kind of share with us the interplay between these different agencies, the private, government, to contribute to this type of data at the end?
Yes, look, it's the interplay is quite complex. The dynamics are continual. So, I mean, I've talked about the Department of Jobs today. We've got the Department of Industry and Science. You know, I talked about ABS, but we've also got Institute of Health and Welfare. There are so many players in the Australian market capturing different parts of data that all come together in one place. I think that you know, the employment services sector, the 250 organisations, you know, they're obviously contributing information about employment services by their data entry on a daily basis into the system. But I think the protocols within the government agencies in terms of how data is collected, shared and pooled is really important in terms of how it works. Like any government responses, we often have silos, and we often have some difficulty in how and between different stakeholders, not just government departments, how they come together in terms of collaborating on data and making sure strategies which might cross over a number of portfolios or jurisdictions, that there's some collaboration in how those issues are addressed. So I think, you know, when it occurs positively, people see the commonalities and the shared responsibility, and they work in collaboration in terms of policy responses to working it through. Quite often with some of those interdepartmental collaboration, one department will still take a lead approach and applying it throughout. But, you know, there's been, and look, we're very fortunate to have the range of data we have, and over the last, probably the last 10 years, we had a government policy about the provision of data and data transparency, which started to bring data out, and, you know, and increasingly now we've been pushed to the usability of that data. So we've seen real change over the last 10 years about the nature of data that's available, the diversity of data, and the transparency of data to open to the open public, not just to practitioners. So it's great to be able to work with other stakeholders now, having that data. When I first started in employment services, and realistically probably, you know, 10 to 15 years ago, we had nowhere near this sort of data. You know, in the organisation I ran, we set up our own data collection. It was focused locally. It wasn't focused nationally. We didn't have that capacity, obviously. But we would do things like regular surveys with employers, regular surveys with job seekers. We would, you know, we would visit councils and collect information on things like building permit approvals, you know, development. So we would do our own, which was very time consuming. And only probably because I was a bit of a data geek, but we would do our own. But it informed our strategies, and we outperformed anyone in our area. And I honestly believe that is because we had really good labour market information, you know, as we could get at the time, and we were proactive in our approach to local skills needs and skills demand matching. We prepared people for jobs that were actually going to be there. You know, which I think at the end of the day is a bit of a responsibility. If you set people up for failure, it has a devastating effect on them. So you're much better off working strategies to engage where you know the evidence says they're going to get a good outcome.
Thank you. I just want to follow up a bit more details, especially on the involvement of the private sector, like yourself. You mentioned about in terms of this non-profit organization, but in a way also you need to survive and continue offering better services. So how could the commissions or the payment be arranged? Is it from the government of Australia, or is it from the individual job seekers? That's the first one. And then I'm trying to connect with the next question. You mentioned about the possibility of bringing down the national data to the provincial, to the local. Yeah. So when it comes to the local employment information, who should produce this? And who conduct, organize the employer survey? Is it done by private or is it by the government?
Yeah. So I'll answer those. The first one, with our contracted providers, and as I said, there's about 250 across all of the programs, different providers. Some of those providers will have multiple contracts. Australia is broken up into what's called employment service regions, and contracts are issued at those regions. So we have some providers that operate in nearly every region across Australia, which there's 51 in all. So they're large organisations. And there's other organisations that are locally based community service that operate in one area. So they all have their contract. Now, payment is primarily paid by government. And I talked about our employment service system. So when we place someone into a job, we would record that in the system. And we're only paid the majority of our outcome when the person sustains employment. So nothing is paid on placement in most programs. There's a very small fee when the person lasts in the job at 4 weeks on a full-time basis. There's a bigger payment when they last 3 months on a full-time basis, but the majority of the money comes when the person has stayed in full-time ongoing work. They can't have a break unless it's paid holiday at 6 months. So it's all outcome driven. So we record those outcomes in the system when they're delivered, and electronically that creates a claim for payment, and the government pay us, the provider, at that point. Now that system interfaces with our income support system, and it's validated by our tax office system. So if a job seeker is in a job and they don't declare their income to the income support, that'll flag that there's an issue, and it may mean we don't get paid, or it may mean that the person hasn't declared properly and they'll have to repay some income support to the welfare system. So it's all validated. So we can't just put someone's worked 26 weeks full time unless we have evidence. So we have to collect wage slips, all of that. So it's unfortunately our system's got a lot of admin, but it's that's to protect the claims integrity and quality of the system, so it's all defensible because it's a contracted sector. So again, the payments come from government. They come to the provider only after the job seekers have achieved sustainable employment outcomes. In some cases, some job seekers, particularly young people who have left school early, we might get a payment for them if they return to full-time study and complete at least a year of study. But, education and training, otherwise you don't really get paid for. So it's really, the focus is on being paid for sustainable employment outcomes. In terms of the national drilling down to the local, so the Department of Jobs and Small Business and Department of Industry are responsible for a whole range of different surveys that they put out. Department of Jobs primarily, it does the monthly vacancy surveys, and it reports them at the aggregate national as well as state and regional, so that you've got that local visibility. There's a range of other surveys they do with employers about the vacancy fill rates, the numbers of applicants they got, the number of applicants that they deem suitable, the number that they interview, so that they conduct all of those reports and release those reports, but mainly via the labour market information portal. So if you go on there and play, you'll see there is just a navigate through it. There's a whole range of data that's accessible to providers from that. Now the other part, and again talking about those local connections, is our local government offices. In most cases, our local government offices have a strong economic development unit, which are always collecting local area information. And they'll also have a community service that's collecting information about local community trends. So we'll have areas where we can see that there's a growing number of new arrivals, migrants, refugees. So that will tell us, we've got this growing trend. This is the place people are choosing after they arrive to settle, so we can be proactive about local strategies. So local government is a critical player for some of that local information, both labour market and demographics. And we have a body that looks after regional Australia, and I showed that slide. They're very much got the graphics there about the local area, and they get most of their data from those councils. But I will say this, again, even if it's the same data that's from the council, it doesn't replace having the face-to-face contact and that partnership, because then you get all of the unpublished data and intelligence they have as well.
Thank you very much. Well, they're still thinking. One more question. In regards to the future employment or forecasting, in Australia, which agency or which ministry normally perform the forecasting?
That's been something that's been changing in Australia. So the Department of Jobs has been responsible for most of the labour market forecasting around industry and development. We Department of Industry has been also doing forecasting around skills needs, and so is Department of Education. So we have a number of departments that have different responsibilities that will all contribute to forecasting and monitoring, particularly around changing nature of work with automation and technology. Australia had a government put together an inquiry last year to make recommendations about how we better manage the transformation and make sure that our labour markets and our strategies are keeping pace with the changing technology. So there have been recommendations put forward about some new arrangements to have a well-coordinated and led approach by government departments in terms of collection, use of data and dissemination of data to inform how we our labour market adaptation as the use of technology rises. I don't know if you're aware, but Australia is currently in an election period. We have a Commonwealth election due to occur on the 18th of May. So it won't be until after that election we actually know what the arrangements will be in by whichever government of the day that we have. But there's certainly a very clear interest in making sure that Australia is well positioned and has a well-informed approach to managing transformation and keeping pace with the changing nature of work. And I have to say, you know, incredibly important, given that technology is the sort of thing that we don't even know what's going to come around the corner. We can see in the Australian labour market, we're losing sales jobs, not only to the internet, but, you know, digital technology within shops that are reducing the number of people. So people can order their meals on an iPad. They don't actually have to have a waiter or waiter take their order, just someone to deliver the order out to them. You know, so we're seeing that the change is ongoing, and it's going to affect most industries and occupations in some ways. You know, some people think that their roles are immune to automation, but we don't know where technology would take us. My role as a policy advisor doing research is, you know, that with machine learning and IAs, there is now automation can actually write a policy paper. You know, I don't think anyone can assume that they're immune from change. Just the other quick thing I'll raise in that is when we're looking at technological change and how it can affect sectors, we've already seen on an international basis a number of employment service areas using technology more and more to service clients. And for some people, that means job seekers service digitally only. They're not always getting face-to-face services. In Australia, the government that we currently have has proposed that from 2022 we have a major rollout of digital employment services. So our job seekers, around 60% of our job seekers under current proposals will only get their service via the internet. So, you know, technology is changing lots of things, including our sector, potentially, so working through there. So, you know, making sure our staff who are currently working one-to-one with people have the skills to utilise information and work digitally and remotely is really important, and making sure that job seekers are digitally literate is particularly important in our situation.
Thank you very much. Yes, other. Move forward.
Hi, I'm Jared, working in Cambodia. You mentioned I would like to commend your work in the labor market information. It's really comprehensive. One thing I didn't see though was your work also include the export and import of labor. That means jobs coming into Australia and jobs like Australians would like to get abroad. I didn't quite see that. And if there is, I'd like to know more information about what Australians would like to do when they go abroad, what jobs they seek, or in the reverse, what jobs Australians need inside the country from, for example, from the ASEAN.
Thank you for your question. Look, yeah, absolutely right. I didn't show anything on import and export of labour. We certainly have very good statistics and labour market information. So we have, and again, it's a range of information. So we have a range of information around skilled visa applicants, people wanting to apply that have got specific skill sets. We have lots of information around temporary visa applicants, working through all of those sorts of things. We're looking, and certainly applicants for permanent visa applications. We have information around that. So we know the types of skills people are wanting to bring to Australia from elsewhere. We have within different industry and areas, we certainly have targeted overseas skills attraction strategies. So our nursing and our teachers will visit a number of different countries, encouraging teachers and nurses to come out here. So we've got lots of information about the skills we need and the overseas skills offer to Australia. In terms of the skills that we have here that are wanted elsewhere, we have lots of data about the types of the nature and the number of people that have moved internationally, and some of the areas of work and skilled work that they've taken up. So we do have that data, probably less on what we've got to offer and more on what we need and what people are trying to bring in. But I'd have to say, of the Australians, our greatest labour export tends to be our youth market. They're more likely to be looking at opportunities to travel and work overseas and build their skills. And it's quite frequent for some of our university graduates to look to international markets to get their early experience in their career and then come back and get a better choice of job in the Australian labour market. So one of the issues with new graduates in the Australian labour market, if they don't have much experience, they tend to have the best opportunities only if they move out to regional and country areas. So for many people, overseas experience is more desirable than that, and then when they come back, they'll get a city-based job.
Yes.
Hello, Miss. Good morning. My name is Faisal from Brunei Darussalam. Okay, my question is, how do you engage with industries in terms of fulfilling the demand Then, do you have any difficulties with engaging with the industry?
If I heard the question correctly, because it was a bit broken up there, how do we actually engage with industries and how do we use the information with industry? Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. So with the Australian Employment Service, it happens at a range of levels. So certainly with government departments, both Commonwealth, state and local, have responsibilities to engage with industries and are having regular dialogue within their jurisdictions. We have a number of associations, peak bodies, and organisations representing the needs of business and industry and particular industry sectors. So they tend to be a conduit for having discussion with the industry at the higher level. On the groundwork and at the local level, most employment service providers, well, I don't know anyone who doesn't, so I'll say all employment service providers will have staff dedicated to working with industry and employers. So they'll be working with them to understand what their needs are, the type of workplace environment that they need people to work in, and what sort of supports and training their workplace offers and what's needed for people to be placed in their jobs. So they'll be doing a lot of that groundwork with local industry, individually working with them and then pulling that information together. That's part of their local labour market intelligence. Quite often what they'll do is work with a number of employers locally from the same type of sector. For example, they might work with a number of people in childcare, and then, you know, they'll do strategies to guide and inform their job seekers or their students. So they might get a number of employers in to do a presentation to groups of students or job seekers about their industry, what they look for, what they want, and encouraging people to think about their career path or applying for roles in there. So a lot of the connection with industry, and particularly small and medium enterprise, is that face-to-face interaction by individual providers at the local level. We work a lot with large employers, but most employment services tend to still work with the branches that operate at the local level. Some of the really large national providers and a couple of the providers have also developed collaborations amongst themselves so that they can better service the needs of large employers who work across the country. We'll work with those large enterprises. But most of the dialogue, say from the government level, the policy level, happens through those representative bodies and industry groups, whereas the service strategies and development happen because of the interface at the local level and those strategies.
Yes.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Eric from the Philippines. Thank you very much for your comprehensive presentation. Earlier, you made mention about the indigenous people and a person with disabilities, and they are also given assistance in terms of job search. My question is, how are the data on the job vacancies for indigenous people and persons with disabilities are generated and posted by companies and other labor market information providers? Thank you.
Hi, thanks for Eric. The data about how different cohorts of the community participate in the labour market, again, comes from a number of sources. So and some of those sources are from the people, the workers themselves. So they're like the census data asks people if they've got a disability and asks them if they're working. So we get some of the data directly from, and same for Indigenous and other people. So some of the information comes from our larger data collection, our national data collection searches. We don't have, there's not a requirement on employers to report some of their workplace diversity strategies. We do have some voluntary strategies. So we have employer champions in areas of disability services, Indigenous services, Indigenous employment, and those employers are transparent and disclose their employment levels. They, we have Indigenous reconciliation plans. So organisations might either have to do a reconciliation action plan if they want to win a government contract, or they might voluntarily do it anyway, in which they will set targets for their organisation for Indigenous employment and those strategies, and they're transparent with their reporting against those strategies. We also, our public service has to declare what it's doing in terms of workplace diversity. So it's the proportion of its workforce that has where workers have a disability or they're Indigenous. So it comes from a range of sources, and of course what we have is our employment services data, which shows how successful people from different backgrounds and circumstances have been getting jobs compared to others. So unfortunately, people with disability and Indigenous job seekers, our first people, still do not fare as well in the job market as others. But there's a range of things that come together, and those indicators are continually monitored, and the providers are required as part of their performance to be ensuring that they're getting outcomes for diverse job seekers. So there's a range of things in there that are moving. I have to say NESA has called for the department and government on a policy where we have a better workforce diversity strategy for Australia. At the moment we have initiatives focused on Indigenous, we have separate ones focused on parents, we have separate ones focused on people, which sometimes can bring them all into a bit of tension with each other. And for employers, it's like everyone's trying to sell a different client group, but really what we should be selling is good workplace diversity, because if employers have good strategies, the workplace will become more diverse and people will more sustainably be included. But we have a range of data there that is reliable data, but no, it doesn't come from industry. Most of it comes from the workers themselves, employment services data. We also have data on education outcomes and education completions by background. So what we know is that people with disability, Indigenous, also don't do as well in course completions as other people do. So that data is used then to get institutions to then look at better supports, a bit of better diversity in the classroom as well.
Any more?
Hello?
Hello, yes.
Hello.
Like all satisfied, I guess. Yeah. So I think we feel like we gained a lot of knowledge from you. So thank you very much again, Annette, for the very good presentations. And I think I could sense everyone would like to get a copy of your presentation. So would you mind later on to send it to me, and then I will share it to the rest of the participants.
You took the words out of my mouth. Thank you very much. I was just about to say it. I'll send this through so you have a copy of it. You've got my email address here. please feel free if you want any other details, you want to have any other links to any other tools or things that you want, or any other data such as the overseas skills data that we have. I'm really happy to give you indications of what we've got and direct you to the site. So please feel free to drop me a line and I'll do what I can for you.
Excellent.
But thank you so much for having me today. Hope I didn't talk your head off. That's all.
Thank you very much. So I will email you so that, not everyone will email you. They will be too overwhelming for you. So I will email you and then I can share to the rest. Okay, so again, have a good day and happy anniversary, 29, is it? Yeah. So. 21.
Yes. All right. Thank you very much. All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay, Arifin. So, anything?